federal government realized that they alone could not provide access, that they needed partners. They needed partners at the institutional level. They needed partnerships with the states. The campus-based aid programs were designed to get colleges to also develop their own grant, loan, and work programs that would be based on need. We also want to change the way that institutions package aid, and we want to change the way that states package aid.
The original premise was states should be in the need-based aid business, and so we had a simple premise: if the federal government put money on the table, would the states match it? And then over time, we really were very serious. No, if we put a lot of money on the table, will states match it?
The campus-based programs, the three of them, what we now call the Perkins Loan Program, began in 1958 as part of the National Defense Education Act. Work-study began in 1964 as part of the Economic Opportunity Act, one of the first pieces of legislation of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society program. And in 1965, the Higher Education Act created the Supplemental Grant Program. Actually, it was the Educational Opportunity Grant Program, and then when Pell came along in 1972, became the Supplemental Grant Program. Those three programs, because of their funding nature, they were then, essentially joined at the hip.
Each of those programs is called campus-based because they are actually administered on campus. The financial aid staffs at those schools take federal funds along with some institutional matching funds, and they determine, based on some federal guidelines, which students should get the grants and how much they should be awarded up to federal limits. A lot of students, for example, use the federal work-study funds for living expenses, for books, educational supplies.
The original intent of the campus-based aid programs was to provide a way that institutions could have some flexibility in awarding aid to particular students.
The notion here is that the government is providing significant resources to institutions for use for their students. And it's probably a good idea for institutions to have some, as we say, skin in the game when an entity has to provide some of its own resources in order to get, a larger share of resources. That's, a pretty good way to help ensure that larger resources, in this case the federal portion, will be well spent.
Certainly they set the groundwork for the federal student aid programs that were more generally available and came along later. They basically provided the political will for us to move forward in the great expansion of our aid system in the 1970s.
Funds for those programs are going to be distributed to institutions based on an application that they would submit. It was basically the way the FAFSA works today for families. But instead of the family applying for help, it would be the school applying to help. The application process was very complicated.
The decisions about allocating those funds were largely peer-reviewed. They were narrative applications. They had peer review panels that were making decisions about awarding institutional allocations based on those proposals.
Basically, those in the know, the grantsmen who knew how the process was going to work, were able to complete their applications in a way that was going to ultimately result in better funding levels. Those institutions who did not have that expertise typically didn't fare as well. After several years of funding it this way, members of Congress were less than pleased about the way the schools were awarding these campus-based dollars. To offset that concern, Congress said we're going to create a basic grant program that would indeed be an entitlement, that the student would be able to count on.
And they all agreed finally to join forces, and they would continue the campus-based programs with some expansion, but they'd also create then the basic grant program.
So a compromise was achieved to protect those institutions who had made major commitments, including parts of their own resources, to help administer these programs. But any new money that would be coming for campus-based would not be necessarily funding those who have had the money in the past, but provide an opportunity for new schools to receive some of this campus-based money.
There was a recognition among policymakers that the federal government had turned over the rationing of its resources to institutions and other providers of information and services, and it recognized that at some point it needed to be in control of its own rationing.
The campus-based programs, the grant, which is now the Supplemental Educational Opportunity Grant, the Perkins Loan, and the Work-Study Program, have all been rather modestly funded compared to the Pell Grant. The Perkins Loan, formerly known as the National Defense Loan, hasn't had any new federal money in it for years. You can still give out loans because part of the funding comes from the collections of your former students back to that program.
There were these entities called the 1202 commissions. This was really an incentive for the states to create a statewide higher education coordinating body. And now the reason that was important is that was also tied with this state student incentive grant program. Those together blended to really create this new state agenda. And if you look, almost all of the states bit on those incentives. But that was very successful in getting the states to think about what statewide planning for higher education. That's what the 1202 commissions were created for, and to get them into the basic business of need-based financial aid. That's what the SSIGs were for.
The SSIG program was set up when the Pell Grant program was set up in 1972, and it got renamed LEAP, I believe, somewhere in the 1990s. And the idea was that the federal government gave an incentive grant to the states, and they said to the states, we want you to set up a need-based grant aid program to supplement the Pell program, and we will give you a core amount as long as every year you put in the same amount of money into the grant program this year that you did the previous year. And it worked really well. We also set up an incentive grant program to get the states to do their share.
The original mission of LEAP and SLEEP was to create state need-based aid programs that would be offered to students that they could combine with their Pell Grant programs to help pay college costs.
The principal issue around LEAP was that it had been successful in bringing the states in, but it was not providing any incentive for the states to increase their partnership in this. And as the cost of higher education went up, there needed to be more state investment, but the states weren't following that lead.
By the time the program had accomplished its stated goal of ensuring that there were state grant programs for low-income students in every state, federal resources were still way less than $100 million a year. And again, when you stack that up with Pell Grants and student loans, that's not a lot of money. So, not to say that there has been no effort in partnering the federal government and states, but the effort just had not been very strong.
The initial seduction worked quite nicely, but it didn't retain sort of a commitment from the states to do more of what they were hoping would occur. And I think that was really more of a design flaw than anything else.
There were always debates on the efficacy of LEAP and SSIG, and the primary debate was whether or not it was supposed to be a temporary program or not. Then there was an other series of debates when community service came in and was very popular in the early 90s. That provision was put in on SSIG, again, always trying to find a new way to reinvent the program so that it would sustain itself. Finally, when LEAP became redesigned, it allowed states even more flexibility in how they set up the programs in a hope that it would get states to permanently buy into the grant program. And unfortunately, this funding died off completely about 4 years ago. And what we've seen is 4 states have shut down their need-based grant programs.
The fact is, the federal government provides a great deal of financial aid, but the states drive access through their tuition policies and their appropriations to institutions.